studying. I know that look when I see it. There is so much content to get through in medical school, which means it's super overwhelming, and cutting corners is part of being efficient. This is especially true if you've left studying till relatively late on in the year, which I'm guilty of.
So today we'll be talking about how to save time in medical school, specifically
the main skills that you need to develop in order to be more efficient in medical school, the high yield resources that will save you guys time, and the best question banks to get through. So, prioritization is your friend. Mental and physical health is obviously your number one priority, and that's something that I have sacrificed way too much in the past and I really regret doing. Beyond that, you have to really prioritize based on your sort of exams. So for us, I know that 60% of our exams are practical and only 40% are theory. So that is definitely guiding what I'm doing. Then in terms of actual content to learn, you can find this out from your medical school. So for us, we have a list of conditions which are graded from A to C. So obviously I'm going to start off with the A conditions and then work my way through to the B conditions if I have time. So I have a pretty useful document on Notion that I use that helps me to actually group the conditions, and so I can filter them based on their prioritization level, and then I can then study them, which I find super helpful. And this is actually something that my boyfriend made for me, and that brings me on to another key skill to develop, which is outsourcing. So if somebody else can do the work for you, then that saves you massive amounts of time and is super helpful. And that's true for lots of other things that I'm going to talk about in a bit, like question banks and other resources. But the way I see it is you have to prioritize going through a lot of different diseases and conditions and knowing a little about everything so that you can diagnose things and you can answer most of the questions in the exam rather than just getting bogged down with a few things and learning them in excruciating amounts of detail. The best way to do this though is to make friends with the year above. So they've done the exams most recently and they'll be completely honest with you about what you do and don't need to learn. So definitely ask them, and they can always point you in the most relevant resources for the medical school that you go to. So prioritization brings me on to the next point, which is high yield resources. So some resources are made better than others, and they'll actually go through the most important concepts that you need to know. If you know me, you'll know that I don't like textbooks because A, I always zone out, and B, it feels really overwhelming, and C, I feel like I've just got lots of useless information thrown at me that isn't very relevant. That being said though, I do really like one book, and that's the USMLE Step 1 book. And that's because they go through a lot of the basic preclinical content by organ system in a really condensed way, and I really, really like that. So what they'll do is they'll go through the heart and they'll go through its embryology, its anatomy, its physiology, the main diseases, and then lastly the drugs that are used. It's super, super helpful, and I really like it because it's very visual and it has a lot of mnemonics. It's also extremely brief, so it only really tells you the background that you need to know. Because of the way that Cambridge is structured, badly, it's really useful to have this sort of resource before you're learning about the conditions, so you can actually refer back to it and have like a good foundation level of knowledge before you're going in and learning everything. But yeah, this is really useful as a refresher and can be useful as well in terms of having mnemonics that will be helpful when you're doing the conditions. In terms of resources for learning about diseases, my favourite of all time is Zero to Finals, and that's because it's explained in such a simple but concise way, so they don't really expect any like background knowledge, and all of the information, it comes in lots of different formats. So there's a podcast, there are videos, and there are online notes. But honestly, just figure out the format that works best for you. It's taken me 21 long years to actually figure out that I'm quite a visual studier, and so the online notes are the best way for me going forwards. What I usually do is I read through the notes, I make sure I understand them, and then I copy and paste them into my notes. There's just no point spending hours and hours making your own notes. Like I said, these resources already exist and it's time for you to outsource. there's no point in you wasting your time making them yourself. The way I make my notes is I do them on Notion, as I've mentioned before. And so what I do is I'll have a page for every condition, and I'll have notes that I've taken from various places and put together in a way that makes sense, because it really varies based on the condition. And that makes sense for us because the next 3 years are all a spiral curriculum, so you build knowledge based on the previous year. And so next year and the year after, I can just add to my notes pages if I need to. It's also super helpful having it as a resource that you can look back on if you get confused at any point, without having to just trawl through all of the notes that are online. Other than Zero to Finals, there are a few other really good high yield resources that I recommend for this. I also really like Almost a Doctor. I really like it for conditions where I can't find them on Zero to Finals. This is slightly longer and it's not as well explained. PassMed has an open textbook as well, which is really good and very, very concise. Sometimes they don't give enough background knowledge though, so it can be slightly confusing. It's very much the bare bones though, and there is a lot of information on management specifically, which is up to date and very useful. In terms of videos, there are a few that I really, really like. I like the osmosis videos. Although what I don't like is that a lot of their things are paid for, and I don't think it's justifiable paying like £200 to £300 for resources when so many of them are free. Medflix is also super good, and everything is explained really concisely and clearly. That makes such a big difference because you don't have to waste lots of time trying to grasp these concepts. In terms of practical things, Geeky Medics is the OG to always go for. Their videos are super useful for the practical examinations, and their notes pages are also pretty good. If I'm really struggling to find information, I sometimes also look at the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine because it's really concise. That being said though, sometimes they don't explain things super clearly, and so it can get a little bit confusing. And then lastly, if you're really, really struggling and it's really niche content you're looking for, Kumar and Clark is a decent textbook to check out. It's something that most medical schools recommend, including my own, so that is something you can go for. I would only really use this as a last resort though, because I find it's not very efficient and I don't have enough time. In terms of concepts and actually understanding the whole diagnostic process, my favourite, which was recommended to me and sent to me by one of my sixth year friends, is the Oxford Cases in Medicine and Surgery. So useful. So the way the textbook works is each chapter will be a specific complaint the patient has, and the way it works is it kind of imagines that you're in accident and emergency and that you need to be ruling out the most dangerous things first, and then ordering the tests and analysing them, and then trying to come up with what is the actual cause of what this patient has and how to figure that out. It's super useful to just dip in and dip out of, and yeah, one of my favourite resources. So that brings me on to section 3, which is note-taking and organisation. So as I said, note-taking isn't super useful. It's not the best way to learn, but it can be quite a good reference and it can help save time in the future. Basically, I have a page for all of the conditions, and I will have notes under those, and these are all linked together because so many conditions are associated, so it's really useful to have that feature, and it's great being able to tag them by organ system. Then what happens is I can also write down when I last reviewed it, and that allows me to have a retroactive revision schedule, so I can see when I last looked at conditions and filter it by that, and so I know what to prioritise next. And that saves me lots more time in the future. In order to make sure that you're actually on schedule, especially if you're working towards a tight deadline, I also find it really useful to have like an Excel sheet where you can note down what chapters or conditions or information you've already been through. You can also see how much you still have left to go through as well. Super, super useful. Because you can see whether you're on track. So the last section is about questions, so specifically focusing on active recall and spaced repetition. So I find that these are really, really important for me to actually be able to retain any information. So with active recall, that's basically you having questions and answering that. So retrieving the information from your head. So spaced repetition is seeing the content at intervals which get longer and longer. So you might have done a certain chapter or condition on day one, and then you're seeing it a day later, and then you're increasing these gaps longer and longer as you get better and you know the content more thoroughly. I find this super helpful because a lot of the time when I study, I'm super guilty of reading the content and kidding myself and saying, oh, I know this, when I don't know it. Like, if you ask me about it later, I would not be able to answer any questions on it. So I find using these in conjunction super helpful. And I use Anki, which is a flashcard app for this, because they combine it really well together. I also really like how there is an element of accountability there, because I have to go through my flashcards every day in the morning. So it just means that I'm very consistent. I tried this with other things, so with question banks, but I just don't think that I have that same level of accountability that I do with the other systems. So yeah, that's why I go with Anki. But the thing is, with all these questions and question banks is, once again, you can outsource this. So you can often get Anki decks from your friends or from other medical students. And if you're using Quizlet, which is another flashcard app, they also have lots of banks of questions which have already been made by other people that you can use, and that's super helpful. Question banks also are a great way of replicating the exam and practicing and checking your knowledge. So the main ones that I'm using are PassMed, but I know other people use things like QuestMed as well. There's like so many questions you can find on Osmosis too. But yeah, it's just a really great way of applying the knowledge and checking that you've been learning things. Okay, so to conclude, I think in order to be efficient with studying in medical school and to be able to cut these corners, you have to really prioritize what content is most important. You also need to be using high yield resources and making the most of friends and older years who can help guide you and point you in the right directions for these. Using questions and lots of spaced repetitions, super useful, and actually facing the questions early on and getting practice with them. I hope you guys found the video useful, and as always, please remember to like and subscribe. That's super useful to me, and I always really appreciate it. That's all from me today. Bye guys.